Okay, let's do an article, shall we? This is from nobility.org, a website I like quite a bit. It's called Baldwin I of Jerusalem receives help from King Sigurd and his 10,000 Vikings. After the fall of Jerusalem, a large number of the Crusaders returned to Europe, leaving the remainder in a precarious position. On the land, they were completely surrounded by hostile Muslims who viewed the militant Christians as sworn enemies of Islam. Not sure how I feel about that. It's not entirely accurate, honestly. It's certainly true that the Muslims of Syria and Palestine viewed the Crusaders as enemies, but a lot of them viewed each other as enemies too. The First Crusade was not the devastatingly tragic event for Islam that it was later made out to be. In fact, the idea that the Crusaders were primarily religiously motivated didn't really occur to the Muslims, especially not in the first few years of the kingdom. I mean, let's face it, they had been fighting armies from the West, Christian armies, for centuries. The Byzantines, In fact, there's a lot of evidence that the Muslims viewed the First Crusade as a Byzantine invasion at first. So, anyway. To the north and east, the territory of the Seljuk Turks had broken down into city-states, but were loosely unified under the Sultan in Baghdad. To the south and west, the Fatimid Egyptians had formed an empire with Cairo as its capital. Any unification of the Saracens and Turks under one strong, capable leader could prove to be disastrous, for they greatly outnumbered the Christian soldiers. Yeah, and again, this is something this gets repeated a lot, and one of the main reasons this came to be the common wisdom, I think, is because Saladin defeated the kingdom of Jerusalem at Hattin, but we forget that was not an inevitable defeat at all. In fact, it wasn't like the kingdom of Jerusalem was really at the mercy of Saladin by 1187. Like, it was just inevitable that they were going to get rolled over. They were actually pretty strong at that point. The kingdom was wealthy. The defenses were good. The castles were strong. The soldiers were good. There was more unity in the kingdom than there had been at earlier times. Really, it was a matter of a decision that Guy Lusignan and Reynald and the Grand Master, what was his name? Gerard de Ridderford. It was a decision. It was a decision they made, to give battle at a bad location, and that's what led to the great defeat. But it wasn't inevitable, and it's true that this idea that unity of the Muslims could be dangerous, but it wasn't nearly as dangerous, I think, as people like to make out. Godfrey of Bouillon was elected king of Jerusalem, but refused the title and crown in a city where Christ had worn thorns. His brother Baldwin returned. Well, actually, I just have to comment on that too. It's interesting. In most of the primary sources, Raymond of Toulouse is the one who is mentioned as saying that first, before Godfrey. And yet Godfrey always gets credit for saying that. Maybe he did say that. Maybe they both said it. Maybe neither of them did. I don't know. His brother Baldwin returned to the county of Edessa, which he had carved out earlier. Bohemond, of course, had remained in Antioch, but soon he went to Europe, unsuccessfully seeking after other ambitions. Just to the north of the Norman Principality, the provincials of the contentious Raymond of Toulouse prepared to attack the fortified city of Tripoli and form the county of that name. Contentious Raymond. Raymond of Toulouse, he always kind of gets a bad rap. I guess because he was, old and gray and haggard, not very dashing looking. This idea that he was kind of, this adjective contentious, that's a very typical way of describing Raymond. Anytime you read fiction set during the First Crusade, Raymond is always portrayed as this kind of grasping, crazy old man who, kind of the way he's portrayed in the Gesta Francorum and other stuff that came from Bowman's camp. But, it's just, I don't think there's much reality to it. I mean, the reality is that Raymond of Toulouse was one of the men chiefly responsible for the success of the First Crusade. Had a lot to do with getting the army to Jerusalem. He may not have wanted to, but he was constantly willing to compromise with the other lords around him. Even if he was, to Bohemond, he was intransigent because he wouldn't agree that Bohemond should rule Antioch, But anyway, I think we shouldn't just take for granted the idea that Raymond of Toulouse was contentious. I think he was one of the most impressive leaders of the First Crusade. Okay. Only Godfrey made any attempt to practice virtue in his relation with others. But unfortunately, he was dead within the year. Okay, that right there is just... There's just really nothing historical about that. Okay, it's true that, Godfrey kind of became the symbol of the First Crusade. He became the legend. But in terms of what kind of leader he was when he was alive, do we have any evidence that he was more magnanimous or less ambitious than the other leaders of the First Crusade? We really don't have any evidence for that. In fact, his behavior at Ascalon, when the Muslims offered to surrender the city to Raymond of Toulouse, that was incredible. Ascalon wouldn't become a part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem until 1153. Imagine if it had become a part of the kingdom in 1099. That would have been incredible. And it would have happened, except Godfrey didn't like the fact that the Muslims wanted Raymond to accept the city. And why did they want Raymond to accept the city? Well, because he had an incredible reputation, including among his enemies. And, that right there says something. When your enemies know that you have integrity and they're willing to surrender to you because they know, at Jerusalem, what Raymond did with the Tower of David, he guaranteed the lives of, the important Muslim leadership of the city. And he got them out. And he honored his word. And that, that's what you want, in siege warfare, in medieval warfare. You want your enemies to trust you. You want them to know that if you say, hey, look, don't put up a fight, and I'll take care of you. I'll make sure you're okay. And they say, well, you know what? That sounds good. We'll do that. You want that reputation. And Raymond had that. He was probably the only leader of the First Crusade that had that. And, Godfrey, he should have respected that. And he should have allowed Ascalon to pass into Raymond's hands. But he was too jealous and proud, And in terms of Godfrey's performance as, the first king of Jerusalem, I think he was, Régine Pernau, who's a famous French historian, she pointed out that everybody in Godfrey's period of time agreed that he was a great leader. And I think that's true. And I think he probably was a good leader and a just leader. But, his character was definitely embellished in the legendary ideas that developed around the First Crusade. Okay, let's keep going here. The nobles of Jerusalem chose Baldwin to replace his brother. His elevation to the throne brought an amazing transformation of a selfish landowner into a fighting crusader. Oh, good grief. Again, here's another one of the common cliches and, ideas about the First Crusade. Baldwin of Bouillon, the greedy, rapacious younger brother who didn't care about the crusade, he just cared about money and land. Look, the reality is Baldwin of Bouillon had a lot to do with the success of the First Crusade. I'm assuming this sentence here about him being a selfish landowner is referring to the fact that, in 1098 he established the county of Edessa in Mesopotamia. I don't see how that can be viewed as anything but just brilliant strategy and one of the most important things that happened during the First Crusade. Well, and again, this is something that is often used to kind of like criticize Baldwin, like, oh, he left the crusade and went off to Edessa. Well, when you're fighting these wars, it's not all about just, sheer, blind devotion. There's also got to be some strategy there. And yeah, I think Baldwin wanted to be a prince, and he wanted to rule his own, sort of little kingdom. But, that ambition created good things for the First Crusade. By taking control of Edessa, which was a wealthy merchant city. He took control of the funds of that city, and he funneled incredible financial support to the siege at Antioch. In fact, really overnight, once Baldwin became master of Edessa, Godfrey of Bouillon, who was at Antioch, went from being, kind of a second-rate leader of the First Crusade to, rivaling Raymond and Bohemond at that point. Because, Baldwin was providing so much support to his brother's army. Horses and gold and everything. So this created a supply line for the Crusaders at Antioch that was, for one thing, very needed because they were very far from Western Europe, obviously, and also they couldn't entirely rely on the Byzantine Empire, But Edessa was there. So what Baldwin did was brilliant, and whatever his motivations were, it's really hard to look into the hearts of these people in the 11th and 12th century and know exactly what they were feeling. And I think they were men of their age, and I think that, the pursuit of land went hand in hand with their piety. Baldwin just happened to be one of the smartest leaders of the First Crusade. And the reality is too, it's probably a good thing that Godfrey died early, because Baldwin is the real builder of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His foresight and his political capability, his ability to control the church, his ability to organize the church and organize his knights, and to direct all of these disparate forces into a productive direction, made the Kingdom of Jerusalem go from just what this article was describing at the beginning, just like a little patch of land conquered around Jerusalem, to this magnificent kingdom. You look at what the Kingdom of Jerusalem was in 1100 when Baldwin I took it, and look at what it was in 1118 when he died. Baldwin had conquered the entire coast almost, except for Tyre and Ascalon. He had established a castle in Arabia, Montreal. He really laid out the borders for the kingdom that would be, pretty consistent for the rest of its history. In the whole history of Crusader Jerusalem, I think he's the most remarkable figure. He was brilliant. And talking about him, being a selfish landowner, it's just kind of silly. Let's keep going. Anything less than maximum courageous leadership would have brought down the Crusader states. When the Rhinelander prince assumed control with only 3,000 fighting men, his power did not extend more than 12 miles outside Jerusalem. In order to secure his kingdom, Baldwin fought several pitched battles against enormous odds with the surrounding Mohammedans, losing some and winning most. Completely landlocked at the beginning, with the exception of the harbor at Jaffa, the dedicated king achieved his greatest success in the capture of the fortified cities along the coast, Arsuf and Caesarea. I think Montreal deserves a mention here because Arabia was very important. But Arsuf and Caesarea fell in 1101 with the help of a Genoese fleet. Another Genoese fleet aided in the capture of Acre in 1104. The Italian merchantmen received ample commercial concessions for their effort. The most colorful assistance came from Norway and their king Sigurd, who had taken the cross. 10,000 Viking Crusaders and 60 ships followed their king around Spain, fighting many battles with the Moors, and into the eastern sea where they spotted a Muslim fleet blockading Acre. When the Saracens saw the lines of dragon ships moving towards them with their long oars sparkling in the sun, they quickly raised the siege and fled. The Northmen then feasted with their grateful host and went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. After the Norwegians prayed at the Holy Sepulchre and said the Stations of the Cross, they asked Baldwin to name one city he most desired to conquer. He named Sidon, the impregnable ancient citadel. From the sea, the Northmen, using ropes and scaffolding, scaled the massive walls and with their fearsome axes cut through the Muslims. Sidon surrendered, and the surviving defenders left with their lives and whatever they could carry. And again, this is another thing that should be noted. Baldwin I kept his word when he was besieging a city. Acre surrendered to him, Beirut surrendered to him, and these people were protected, when they surrendered their cities, as opposed to Caesarea, which did not surrender to him, and he dealt very harshly with them once he actually did enter the city. Laden with spoils and gratitude, the hardy Norwegians returned home. Along the coast, only Ascalon and Tyre remained in Muslim hands when Baldwin died in 1118. Very good. That's by Jeremias Wells. History of Western Civilization, page 241 through 242. And I think, we can kind of overstate this idea of contention among the various princes of the Crusader states. Early on, there was a lot of unity, is the reality. You look at guys like Jocelyn I of Edessa, Pons I of Tripoli, Baldwin II, Baldwin I, Tancred, Roger of Salerno. This era, there was incredible cooperation among the Crusader princes. And, on multiple occasions, Edessa was invaded from Baghdad and from that region. And every time, the king of Jerusalem, usually with the Count of Tripoli and the Prince of Antioch, met this invasion and repelled it. And this is why Edessa was protected for so long. Later on, there would be this unity, with people like Jocelyn II and Raymond of Antioch. But in this early period, there was incredible cooperation. Tancred was kind of the most contentious, I think, of all these guys. But even he, submitted to Baldwin I, King Baldwin I's authority when he was pressed to.